I wonder if there is, Reich also has an influence in it. So I wonder if there is a line of escape within psychoanalysis that you, 4 years after the publication of the book, you would be interested in perhaps
So
explore.
yes, that continues until today. So.
Yes, or that interrupts perhaps la psicoanalysis de lo mexicano, that a real wild psychoanalysis, like the wildest of psychoanalysis, perhaps. I don't know if there has been experiments in that particular, because I see that there is this, the ideological framework doesn't fit within psychoanalysis somehow. It becomes, it's a graph that doesn't take place.
Yes. And actually, yeah, I think you're right, because one of the, the first book that was explicitly trying to use psychoanalysis to read Mexico, and then somehow failed, was the father of Mexican psychoanalysis, the founder of the first analytic institute in Mexico City, was called Santiago Ramirez. And he wrote a book called Psychoanalysis of the Mexican, Psicoanálisis de lo Mexicano. Not the Mexican person, but the Mexican culture. And it really doesn't work, it's too direct. He's a bit clumsy. For example, it's funny sometimes. So at one point he says, "Why do Mexican kids like to break piñatas?" And he says, "Aha! It's the belly of the pregnant mother. They don't want, So a lot of it is like that. It's just too direct, not thinking. Well, not thinking politically, but also not thinking philosophically or trying to see outside the frame. So in that case, it didn't work. Whereas I think Le Mercier would be a bit someone like Carranca, who are really trying to think outside the frame and really use this wild possibility to connect it with everyday life and politics. But as to the question of what remains today, I don't know. Maybe you know.
No, I don't. It's the question of continuity.
Do you think art? One possibility would be to think what's really alive right now in Mexico City. That would be contemporary art. So
curation. I would say curators.
Yes.
Perhaps. Playing with the questions of the cure, the question of the curation.
Yeah.
But the continuity itself, if we are in a post-mestizaje moment, what ideological function would, or perhaps it would be a good moment for psychoanalysis, because it might be free from all of that heavy.
Yeah.
Even in your other book, when you go into the technological imaginary, you're already at the margins of the official ideological nationalist framework of the 1920s and 30s. So there's tension there between all of these great disciplines of the 20th century that have been so important in Mexico.
Yeah, I think for part of what I was trying to do in this book, but also in Mexican modernity, which is about the avant-garde, was I think it happens everywhere, but in Mexico there's there's a canon of thinking Mexican history and Mexican culture that has several tropes, several important authors, and as it usually happens after a few years, this becomes a bit fossilized. It becomes, I think, many scholars tend to just repeat the same ideas. It becomes a bit received. And for me, I think Freud, and thinking about Freud in Mexico, was a way to maybe get out of that box and look at some of these figures. For example, Octavio Paz is usually put in that box of thinking about Mexican identity. But I thought it was much more interesting if one looks at how Paz was reading Freud. It becomes a very different Octavio Paz. So yes, and I think a lot of my work has really been trying to get away from these, very canonical ideas about Mexico. The other idea that came to mind is what's very ironic today is that now Mexico City is one of the psychoanalytic capitals of Latin America. Now psychoanalysis has taken root, thanks in part to a very important Argentinian immigration in the 70s during the military dictatorship. And this is actually, I always love talking about this when I teach Freud, because Elizabeth Rodinesco has said this, that psychoanalysis has always been stamped out of any dictatorship, whether of the left or of the right. So Stalin did not tolerate psychoanalysis, the Argentinian military, one of the targeted groups was psychoanalysts. Fidel Castro, there's no psychoanalysis in Cuba. So it might seem puzzling. If you're a dictator, especially at war, you have so many other things to worry about. Why would you be concerned about someone lying on the couch talking about dreams and slips on the tongue? And I think there's something in the idea of free association. That psychoanalysis is really a mental space of freedom in which there can be no boundaries. Free association can just be continued almost infinitely. And psychoanalysis creates the experience of freedom, and it creates free subjects, ideally. And this can be very threatening, in a world in which you want to give very clear ways of reading history, politics, and whatnot. But what's ironic is that I think now, after that immigration in the 70s, there are hundreds, maybe even over 1,000 analysts in Mexico City. It's perfectly accepted to be in therapy. Many people are in therapy. But I think what has been lost is these types of experiments. So you have an institutional use of psychoanalysis, but not a wild use of psychoanalysis. Whereas I think when these experiments were happening, there was not that clinical practice in place.
Yeah, it almost seems like, from what you're saying, that wild psychoanalysis is really the subversive psychoanalysis in some ways, because as you were saying, it was no, right after at that time, there were no juridical legal structures that were strong enough to reject psychoanalysis, but it actually created this wild space of, in a way, accents of the judge. Of the judge in the sense of the juridical system, or at least a weak juridical system that allowed a certain kind of, maybe even collective unconscious to be more open and therefore to have more space for psychoanalysis. So it almost seems that what we are calling wild psychoanalysis as something much more subversive than the clinical institutionalized psychoanalysis that Freud was practicing. So anyway.
Yeah, I like that. So even the psychoanalytic institution was weak in the same way that the juridical institution was weak in the 40s. Yeah, I think that's true.
So during the second juridical trials, did they ever pathologize their subjects?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, there aren't that many articles. There are 3 articles that Carreca published. One, he was found guilty. It was a man who was killed his wife. He was found guilty. And psychoanalysis just became a tool to talk about the unconscious motives, etc. And I think that's what he would try to do. Not to use psychoanalysis to absolve someone, but actually to understand more of its name.
Thanks for a really great talk. I come from the history department. It always seems there's a lack of Latin American intellectual history that actually takes what has seemed to be European stories. Everyone writes about psychoanalysis historically in the European context and not in Mexico, and in Latin America more broadly. And I was really intrigued when you were talking about the history of psychoanalysis and then Mexico being seemingly this little blip on the screen, but then actually playing an important role. And I was reminded of Jorge Cañizares Esquerra, who's a historian who I think writes very well about European and Latin American intellectual history, sort of the interchange. And he makes the argument that The Tempest, Shakespeare's play, is actually inspired by experience of the New World. And so once you start thinking in those terms, there's a lot of European intellectual, cultural production that can be inspired by, very much linked to Latin America in a lot of different ways. And so I wonder, during this project, if you sort of thought a lot about those larger questions, and also maybe if it was sort of easier for you coming outside of the history department maybe to write this intellectual history in a way.
I think so. I think this book has wild on the title, and I think well, let's say I had to wait until I had tenure to write this book. And if I had written this before, I think it would have been too wild for a lot of colleagues. But I think it's good too. I think I agree with you that it's actually, that's something we can learn from psychoanalysis, is precisely this wild Deleuze. It's what he tries to do. You know, it's a use of Freud that is, you know, it's not about making things rigid. It's about thinking and carrying free association into the space of intellectual freedom.
Yeah, which is not how Freud is read in this country, right?
Yeah. We know. I think also, for me, you know, I'm from Mexico, and what's very ironic is, I mean, at least for, you know, at least for my intellectual circle, I think, so being in Mexico and thinking about Europe, it's not a relation of opposition or of tension. It's really quite natural. You know, there's, you know, many those people refer to French intellectuals, or yes, I think especially France has been a very important place in Mexico, but you know, Freud as well. And what's funny is that there's never, when it's looked at from, especially from the United States or from American academia, it always seems like two incompatible extremes of the world, like Latin America and Europe. Whereas seen from Mexico, it's a much more natural, much more linked exchange. So I think, you know, the book tries to reflect that. You know, it's really, I felt that I was thinking about it from Mexico, you know, from this perspective where, you know, I was actually, now I'm writing on Proust, you know, it's a similar project. It's about Proust and Latin America. And I was really struck when I was maybe 22 and I was beginning grad school, and I was talking about Proust to a French professor, and the French professor said something, it's so interesting to see Latin Americans fascinated by French culture. I had never thought about it. I mean, for me, Proust was a writer. I mean, of course, I knew he was French, but you know, he was this major writer, and there was never any sense that there was something strange about someone from Mexico looking at Proust, or vice versa. But you know, I think it's a difference between looking at something from Mexico and looking at it from the outside in which Mexico becomes marginalized.
Well, thank you, Professor. Those who are coming to the dinner, we can just walk over from here. And everyone else, on March 6th, from 4:10 to 5:30, just like today, Professor Sven-Erik Rose in the German department is giving a talk on post-memory and the archive.
So what